My brothers and sisters, may the Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Some Pharisees and Herodians were sent to Jesus to ensnare him in his speech. They came and said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are a truthful man and that you are not concerned with anyone's opinion. You do not regard a person's status, but teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Is it lawful to pay the census tax to Caesar or not? Should we pay or should we not pay?" Knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, "Why are you testing me? Bring me a denarius to look at." They brought one to him, and he said to them, "Whose image and inscription is this?" They replied to him, "Caesar's." So Jesus said to them, "Repay to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God." They were utterly amazed at him. The Gospel of the Lord. As we look back at the history of the early church, we find that in those initial moments of it, there was a great anticipation that the Lord would return very quickly, so much so that for a time people stopped doing everything under the assumption that he was going to appear in any moment. And they finally had to come to the realization that you have to still live in this world if you're going to be able to survive, and you have to take some responsibility for it. It also was found during that time that some people began to wander away from the faith precisely because of the fact he had not yet come. Somebody else would come along and say, "He hasn't shown up yet, why don't you follow me instead?" And so there's a whole score of little heresies that begin to erupt. And it is in the context of that environment that Peter in this second letter speaks to the early church and reminds them to be steadfast, to be patient, to allow themselves to wait for the Lord upon his way and his will rather than their own, and to consider the patience the Lord had shown in showing salvation to begin with. And then the message is picked up on another way in the gospel this morning with Mark, where they come to very cleverly try to trick Jesus into giving an answer that will end up sending him off to punishment. If he says give to Caesar, then it means all of a sudden that he's not in favor with God. If he says give to God, it means all of a sudden he's not in favor with Caesar. And so they ask the question, do we have to pay the tax? And Jesus very cleverly says to them, well, let me see a denarius and what's on it. And even that action, of course, there's some kind of unconsciously happening, because for the pious Jew who was not supposed to have any graven images, here they are using currency that has the image of Caesar. And so here they're pulling out of their own pockets against their own faith, the very coinage, which in fact they're not to have anything to do with. And so he shows it to them, and in turn he says, what's on the coin? And they say, well, it's Caesar. And Jesus very cleverly ends up answering the question, not by saying one or the other, but dividing it and suggesting you give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and you give to God what belongs to God. And of course, that's the bottom line for all of us in life, that we have to be prioritizing always first and foremost the ways and the plan and the mission of the Lord, but that also concretely in living in this world, there has to be some responsibility from the context of the world's needs to do things as the world needs as well. And so we are asked to kind of balance those off and to realize how they work one with each other. Sometimes, of course, they don't work so easily. We find that in many of the stories of the history of martyrs, that precisely because they're staying true to the message of the gospel, they found themselves as being enemies of the state, and as a result, lost their lives literally because they made the choice of God over mammon. Today, then, let's be mindful of the fact of how we too in our own lives and the little ways that we experience each day must balance those things in our life between what is most important and that which is secondary.